Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies revision video. I'm Wardle, and today we are talking about miracles for the AQA paper 1 exam. So this is of course one of our key philosophy of religion topics for the AQA paper 1 exam, and we'll be looking at the realist and anti-realist understandings of miracles. There are lots of synoptic links for us to make today to different topics on the paper, so we'll be bringing in a lot of what we spoke about when we studied religious experiences, and we'll also be making lots of links to religious language as well. Just before we get started and cover everything you need to know for an A star, I thought you might like to know in terms of the etymology of the word miracle itself. It comes from the Latin miraculum, which means wonder. So yes, just something to think about as we get started today. In terms of where this all fits in then on paper 1, remember paper 1 is going to be 3 hours long. It's worth 100 marks, and we will be spending half of that time talking about the philosophy of religion. And in that section, we could be asked about any of these topics: the teleological argument, cosmological argument, or ontological argument. We could be asked about evil and suffering, religious experiences, religious language, miracles, and also about self and life after death. So, we're going to be focusing on miracles today, but as I say, there are lots of synoptic links we can be making when we're talking about miracles, primarily to religious experiences and also to religious language. In terms of your two key terms then that you need to know today, they are realist and anti-realist. Yeah, this whole section is framed around this debate and this, this discussion, if you like, between those who take that realist view on miracles and those who take the anti-realist view. So really important we establish that the realist view is the stance, the position that miracles are seen as real events brought by God. And, that key term really is self-explanatory, isn't it? You're called a realist because you believe that they are real events that actually happen. Whereas an anti-realist then is the stance that miracles are an interpretation of the mind. So they may be seen as symbols or as something that lifts the spirit or transforms a community, but it's not necessarily a real event. It is, an interpretation of the mind. So for a realist, you're going to take that objective view on miracles, aren't you? That they are actual events that actually happen. Whereas for an anti-realist, it's a much more subjective position because it's about an interpretation of the mind. And so it's about something having meaning and value for the individual. And as I say, we are then going to make those links throughout the video to religious experiences and also to religious language. So please make sure whenever you are writing in your philosophy exam, you are making links if they are valid or appropriate. Bring those scholars in, use different scholars from different topics to provide your evaluation and your critical analysis, for example. And I'll be signposting that to you as we go through this video. In terms of the key scholars we need to know then, we'll be talking today in no particular order about Paul Tillick, about David Hume, about Maurice Wiles. And remember, we are going to need to compare them. Those two are named on the specification. And so at the end of today's video, we're going to do some really interesting comparison work in terms of looking at the comparisons between Hume and Wiles in their perspectives. We'll be looking at Holland and also at St. Paul, because St. Paul said that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is pointless and you are still in your sins, emphasizing the importance of Jesus's miraculous resurrection. And so we'll be asking, was that a real event that happened? And then if you take the anti-realist view that the resurrection is just an interpretation of the mind, what are the implications of that for theism? We'll be considering how the realist and anti-realist positions or points of view impact on Christian beliefs today. So a lot to talk about. Just to then reiterate for you, before we then start to explore these two in detail, we have got, and we have to remember this whenever we talk about miracles, these two key stances, as we call them. We've got the realist view, the realist stance, and then we've got the anti-realist stance. And we must always think about them in discussion with one another. You've got to imagine they're on opposite sides of a debating chamber, and you've got your realist scholars saying one thing, and then you've got your anti-realist scholars arguing another thing. So our realist scholars are going to argue that miracles are seen as real events brought about by God. It's really important that I emphasize to you that phrase, are seen, because our key thinker on the realist side of the argument, David Hume, doesn't actually believe miracles happen, but he says that they should be seen as real events brought about by God. And then he makes it his mission to show why they're not true. Yeah, he then actually says that they are faith-based fabrications. And, you know, he completely destroys the idea that miracles actually happen. But he is arguing that whenever you talk about miracles, you should be talking about them as if they were real events brought about by God. And as I say, a key thinker we'll talk about is David Hume, who then sets out to show that miracles are faith-based fabrications. On the other hand, we have the anti-realist view, and this is the stance that miracles are to be seen as an interpretation of the mind. So that is, of course, very different, isn't it? You know, you can either have a real event or an interpretation of the mind. So for a realist, the focus is obviously going to be on the real world and on an objective event. Whereas for your anti-realist, your focus is going to be in the mind, isn't it? And it's going to be very much subjective, because what goes on in your mind is subjective to you. You know, we could both see the same thing happen, for example, and interpret it in very different ways. As we know from our days of doing GCSE English, for example, different people would interpret the same poem in very different ways. And so interpretation tells us this is a very subjective, individualistic thing. It's about the meaning and significance it has for the individual. Whereas, of course, with that realist view, it's very much objective. It's that it actually happened, and therefore you can categorically say whether it's real or not. Whereas with that anti-realist view, that's much more difficult, isn't it? Because it's a matter of personal opinion and whether something has meaning for that particular person. So they may be seen as symbols. So, of course, a really important link to Tillick when he's talking about religious language as something that lifts the spirit or transforms the community. And our key thinker there is going to be Maurice Wiles. Now, another key thinker is going to be R.F. Holland, who described miracles as a coincidence that can be taken religiously as a sign and called a miracle. And that phrase there, taken religiously, really emphasizes to us the idea that they are an interpretation of the mind. It's about how you interpret something. And Holland says that is based on your form of life. Yeah, so he's heavily influenced by Wittgenstein. And he has this idea that, you know, if you operate within that religious form of life, then you are going to take that coincidence as a religious thing and call it a miracle. Whereas if someone was an atheist, for example, they might just say, yeah, that was good luck. That was great. Well done. So really interesting to be thinking about these two perspectives. Our realist view, which is all about taking it as an objective thing that then we can say, did it happen or not? Whereas then your anti-realist view, where it's about that, you know, interpretation of the mind. And so it's much more subjective and individualistic in terms of then verifying it, if I can use that word, and assessing it. So lots of links I hope you can see already to religious experience and religious language. Let's get started, shall we? Because I want to start by having a look at realism as a whole. So for someone who is a realist, they generally hold these understandings of the world. They generally believe that the scientific theories give us true descriptions of the world. So instantly you can see that link there to science, great link to paper 2 when you're studying Christianity and science. They also believe that they give us knowledge of things that we believe to exist but cannot observe. They also believe that the world is mind independent, and that is very, very important. The world is mind independent. It exists the way it is, regardless of what we think. Remember, with an anti-realist, it's all about interpretation of the mind. Whereas for a realist, the world is mind independent. It doesn't matter about how you've understood something. There is out there an objective truth, an objective reality. And so if we apply this to miracles, a realist account sees them as real events brought about by God or someone empowered by God, whether you believe that it is by God or not. Yeah, a realist would say it must have really happened or not. It's not about your personal perspective. It's not about your personal interpretation. It either happened or it didn't. And so God exists as a real being who is transcendent and unobservable, who creates and cares for the world. So for your realists, they believe that real events happen, that, these miracles, therefore, would be real events brought about by God. This is not about a personal interpretation of something that's happened. For a realist, when they speak about miracles, they're not talking, about your interpretation of something. They're making a claim about something that has happened, and that is objective. It is mind independent. And so someone who is a realist in the scientific sense will generally accept these statements, that the best scientific theories that we now have give us true, or at least approximately true, descriptions of the world. They believe these theories also give us true or approximately true descriptions of things that we believe to exist, but which cannot be observed. And I did mention that a moment ago. For example, we have no direct observational evidence that quarks exist, since no one has seen an isolated quark, yet the indirect evidence for their existence is so overwhelming that for a realist, it can be considered a proof. The standard model of particle physics, did you know, does not make sense without quarks, so they must exist in some manner. And this is this key idea here, that we see in science all the time about things either being true or at least approximately true based on observation. Yeah, it's that empirical method, isn't it, which we've spoken about a lot over the course. And they also believe that the world is mind independent, meaning that the world exists and is the way it is, regardless of what we think. So when you're thinking about your realist, you are really thinking about your empiricism, you're thinking about objectivity, and you're also thinking about science. It's really important that we always link it back to the science. Yeah, because it is this idea that we're gaining knowledge through observation of actual real events. And we're going to look at the relevance of this to miracles now, because a realist would therefore believe that miracles are a real part of what happens in the world. They would say they are brought about by God or by someone who is empowered by God to bring them about. For example, people like Moses and Elijah in the Old Testament, or by another spiritual force. God exists as a transcendent and unobservable being. So this is that idea that there are things that we can't directly observe. Nevertheless, miracles are the evidence of God's existence and of his care for the world. That key idea from John Polkinghorne, for example, in paper 2 of providence. And these things are true despite the fact that we do not understand everything about miracles. So when a realist informs us that a miracle has taken place, they are therefore telling us about something that they believe has happened in the external world, telling us about the nature of the event, and making a claim about the supernatural cause of the event. This is really important. And what we're going to do now is look at the 3 key realist understandings. Now, what I would like you to do is click on the link in the description box and make sure you download the PowerPoint for yourself, because what you can then do is print this table and then fill in as we go through the different columns. So we're going to be looking at what the understanding is. We are then going to look at case study examples of that understanding for our AO1 answers, and then we're going to look at evaluation and critical analysis of that understanding in that final column for our AO2 answers. So really important that when we're revising for miracles, we're thinking, what is the realist understanding? What case study examples can I use to illustrate that to get my AO1 marks? And what evaluation and critical analysis can I include in order to get my AO2 marks if it was a 15 marker? So we're going to be looking at these 3 here. And as I say, for each one, we're going to look at your case study examples for that understanding. And then we're going to do our evaluation and critical analysis. So let's get started with the first realist understanding, that miracles are an extraordinary coincidence of a beneficial nature. So this is the idea that miracles are an extraordinary coincidence of a beneficial nature. Now, one example of a coincidence miracle is the Westside Baptist Church gas explosion, which happened in Nebraska in 1950. Now, just listen to this. It's quite an extraordinary story. So the explosion demolished the church and it would have killed its choir, but all 15 members were late, each for different reasons, to choir practice on that day. And so they all avoided certain death. So they obviously had a set time to be at their choir practice, didn't they? And they were all traveling there to get there on time. Now, at that time, the explosion happened. So let's say it was 6 o'clock, for example. So at that time, at 6 o'clock, when the choir practice was meant to start, and so they were all meant to be there, you know, doing their vocal warm-ups, that's when the explosion happened. And they were all making their way there to be there. However, on that day, each of the 15, just so happened to be late. Now, they weren't all traveling together. It wasn't a case of they were all stuck on the same bus, but each of those 15, as an individual, just so happened to be late. And so they all 15 avoided certain death because the whole church exploded. You know, this massive gas explosion. It would have been catastrophic if all 15 had got there on time, but none of them got there on time for all different reasons. And we have to then ask, don't we? This is an extraordinary coincidence of a beneficial nature. You know, this is such a coincidence. You know, surely this is too much of a coincidence to have just happened. You know, surely there is a higher power behind this because it just seems too good to be true. And it seems too good to be a coincidence. Now, a second example is Julianne Kopeck's survival of a plane crash in 1971. And again, this is an extraordinary story. So she was on board flight 508 when it crashed in a thunderstorm, and that killed all 6 crew and 85 out of the 86 passengers on board. Julianne was the sole survivor. So of all those people, she was the only one that survived. Now, she obviously survived the initial crash, but they were in the middle of this jungle, right? They're in the middle of this jungle. And she sustained these really awful injuries, as you would, wouldn't you, in a crash where everyone else has been killed, including a broken collarbone. But she managed to survive a 9-day journey through the jungle in order to reach help. So again, we seem to have this extraordinary story, you know, of this one person surviving against the odds. Again, it seems too good to be true for her. How did she do that? Was it just luck? Or would there be another explanation? And so this is, you know, really important in terms of thinking about miracles as extraordinary coincidences of a beneficial nature. Now, we obviously have to ask some really critical questions here in terms of our evaluation and our critical analysis of the realist account of miracles. You know, the first one to ask, for example, I think is about the plane crash, because if God is the reason that Julianne Kopeck survived, what about the other people, you know, the 91 passengers and crew who did not? So yes, okay, her survival could be a miracle, but hang on, you know, what do we then say about all the people who did die? Surely this raises questions about God's omnibenevolence, why he would perform this extraordinary miracle for her, but then the other 91 people have been left dead. You know, it seems to place limitations, doesn't it, on God's omnibenevolence, because he's chosen to do all of this to save her, but he's happy for the others to all die. So we then ask questions such as, were the other passengers less worthy? Why would God pick and choose who he performs miracles for? Could that prove that actually it's not a divine miracle, because the real miracle would have been stopping the entire plane from crashing, not having the plane crash, having over 90 people dead, but then performing this really extraordinary miracle for one individual? There are also other details about that story that raise questions. For example, as a child, Julianne had been taught about foraging and survival in a jungle by her father. That had been part of her upbringing. So actually, you know, she was able to fend for herself in those conditions because she'd had experience in that context before. And so we could say, actually, you know, it's a case of she was put into that position, and then because of what she'd learned earlier in life, she was able to survive. So it wasn't necessarily as miraculous as it seems, because actually she did have the skill set to survive in those circumstances. But, you know, we really do have these big questions to ask about, was this really a miracle? Because what about the other people who did lose their lives? And then what about the other factors that could have contributed to her survival? Could we just say that it's extraordinary good luck? Or does this demonstrate, does this prove that there is a God who has intervened to perform this miracle? Because there's no way she could have survived otherwise. And then if we think about the West Side Baptist Church as well, we've got to ask, well, what role did God play in this? You know, how did this actually happen? For example, did God manipulate the personal circumstances of each choir member individually so as to make them late? Why would he bring about their survival, but not the survival, A, of the church, you know, his place of worship, you know, why is the church being destroyed? But also, why not the survival of countless other victims of explosions recorded each year throughout the world? What was it about those 15 people that meant they survived that explosion, but then we've got so many gas explosions going on and so many explosions of all types going on around the world, and those people are all losing their lives? So, you know, again, it's this question of, well, you know, if God does perform miracles, why is he picking and choosing in this way? Does this not raise questions about his omnibenevolence? And of course, we spoke about that a lot with the problem of evil and suffering, you know, and I think straight away about process theology and that idea that God does not intervene, you know, and God has just created the world and left it to its own devices. But this is very much a God who is intervening, but he's picking and choosing when he intervenes. And so you could say, you know, that raises really serious questions for theists in terms of, if miracles do really happen, what does that tell us about God and the nature of God? Does that not raise questions about his omnibenevolence? And also about the practicalities of that, you know, why did God go out of his way to make sure all those people weren't there? Why didn't he just stop the gas explosion happening in the first place? You know, it's again this question of, are we talking about a God of the gaps here? When people don't understand how all 15 people could have been so lucky, they then jump to the conclusion, well, it must be God. You know, obviously for the members of the choir, if they're singing in a church choir, think about language games, you know, they're going to be operating within a religious form of life anyway, aren't they? So it would make sense to them that it was God who saved them, because clearly religion is a big part of their lives. They do have belief in God. But if someone doesn't believe in God, are they going to think, yeah, that was God who absolutely made sure each of those 15 people was late? Why wouldn't God just stop the explosion happening in the first place, for example? So really important, you know, when you're thinking about these understandings, you've got examples of them, but then also you're doing your critical analysis and your evaluation. Okay, our next one then. And this is, I think, the one that we are probably most familiar with, because it's what we read in the Bible, which is, of course, your Christian scripture. So our second understanding is miracles as an event brought about by the power of God or another spiritual power working through people. So if we read the Bible contains many examples, doesn't it, of God acting through people in this way. For example, God acts through Moses, whose actions in carrying about the 10 plagues on Egypt, of course, in Exodus, in the Old Testament, are given through the power of God, through the power of Yahweh. Moses is instructed by God in how to perform the great miracle of Israel's deliverance when trapped between the sea and the pursuing Egyptian chariots, that key story of the parting of the Red Sea. And then, of course, if we look in the New Testament as well, we see God working through people in order to perform miracles again. So the 37 miracles of Jesus, for example, recorded in the New Testament, are also interpreted historically by many Christians as real events that happened. You know, Christians do believe he did walk on water. He did turn water into wine. He did feed the 5,000. And so the importance of miracles is seen very clearly here, isn't it? In terms of, you know, identifying Jesus as the Son of God and giving Christians a reason to believe in him, because he is seen as having these divine powers, because God has worked through him in order to perform these miraculous signs and do these amazing things. Now, the importance of miracles as demonstration of divine power and compassion is particularly important for the Catholic Church, because did you know this? If you want to be a saint, in the Catholic Church, you have got to have performed a miracle either in your lifetime or after your death. So the Catholic Church has something called the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, and it's their job to investigate accounts of miracles attributed to people being considered for canonization, which means to be made a saint. So if you do want to be a saint, you need to get performing miracles. You need to start performing miracles, because that will get you a big tick from the Catholic Church, and that will fast track you to canonization. But that demonstrates the importance of miracles being real events, because you have got to have performed a miracle, or God has got to have performed a miracle through you in order to be considered for canonization. So that emphasizes, doesn't it, the importance of miracles as real events where, you know, God works through you in order to do something in the world. You know, again, showing God's immanence, his involvement, his care, concern, providence for the planet. So in terms of your critical analysis for this explanation, the key criticism really is that there are alternative explanations for these miracles in scripture. So, for example, the 10 plagues could be alternatively explained. So it was not God working through Moses. For example, the sudden appearance of the red-hued water in the Nile could have been caused by a red algae bloom. Yeah, so the water didn't turn to blood. It was actually red algae bloom. Not quite as dramatic, you know, but it could be an explanation. Again, that God of the gaps argument that we've spoken about on paper 2, that when that happened at the time, people didn't understand this as a scientific or geographical phenomenon. They thought it was the work of God. So, you know, that's why people then thought it was a plague being sent by God. They didn't understand, you know, that it could be explained at a scientific level, at a geographical level, because, you know, science and geography were not as developed, of course, then as they are now. And so people attributed them to God as they lacked scientific understanding of the phenomena happening. So we could, you know, explain away all of the 10 plagues. And so we could therefore show that they weren't actually miracles. They all have a scientific explanation. The same could be said of Jesus's miracles. You know, they should not necessarily be taken as literally true. Reza Aslan, for example, a contemporary scholar, warns that the Gospels are unreliable as historical documents. You know, we don't have any video footage, for example. There is no CCTV of Jesus walking on water. We cannot just trust what we read in the Bible. He says, Aslan says, that the Gospels contain embellishments and even flat out fabrications designed to convince their reader that Jesus is the Son of God. So, of course, they were written by the evangelists, people wanting to convert people to Christianity. And so he argues that the miracles you read about in the New Testament didn't actually happen. They were just used in order to persuade people. They're a persuasive device. Yeah, the gospel writers thought, right, how do we convince people that this man is the Son of God? How do we convince them to join our religion? I know, let's say he walked on water. Let's say he rose from the dead. And so we could actually argue that there is not sufficient evidence from scripture that those miracles actually happened, because there is no evidence beyond scripture that Jesus actually performed those miracles. And Bultmann said that we cannot use electric lights and radios, and in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament, by which he means that for a 21st century reader, you can't just believe everything in the New Testament is literally true. You can't believe it really happened. And this is, of course, really important when we are thinking about realism and anti-realism in general. He is arguing, you know, you can't read scripture and think, yeah, that means Jesus literally walked on water. Yeah, Jesus literally turned that water into wine. He might argue that you need to see that as symbolic or as a sign, for example, and we'll talk about this in a moment when we talk about Tillick and anti-realism, but not necessarily as a real event. Because, you know, in the modern world where we do have science, we do have, you know, much more knowledge and understanding of the world, we can actually look at the scripture, we can actually read the Gospels and say, that didn't really happen though, did it? You know, it's an important sign, it's an important symbol, for example, but it didn't objectively happen because it's just not possible. It's just not something that's done. So really interesting when we're thinking about where we're getting our evidence from, when we're then evaluating that evidence. And the argument here is that the Old Testament and the New Testament are unreliable as evidence for miracles, because actually You know, what happened, for example, in Exodus could be alternatively explained, and what is recorded in the New Testament might not necessarily have happened. Okay, a bit more evaluation for you, though. The Catholic Church today does believe that God performs miracles through people, and they take great care to verify this. Really key word, verify, of course, reminding you, I hope, of the verification principle from religious language. As I said before, the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints investigate accounts of the supposed miracles. They interview witnesses and gather medical evidence, for example, from Lourdes in France. In order for someone to be canonized and made a saint by the church, they have to be shown to have performed miracles. And that, of course, does show the importance of miracles for Catholics. They are taken as signs of God's action through the world, and Catholics believe that they do actually happen because, of course, you know, if they were just interpretations of the mind, for example, then nobody would be able to verify them. But the church believes that they can be verified, which then helps with someone's case to being made a saint. So really important to consider that the Catholic Church, with 2.4 billion followers today, I believe, they still stand by that idea. No, 1.2 billion, sorry. I've doubled them. I've doubled the church. The Catholic Church has 1.2 billion followers. Do excuse me. But yeah, still a lot of people, of course, more than Kylie Jenner on Instagram. But the Catholic Church is in a position here where they believe that miracles are important and they do really happen, and they use them as evidence for someone's canonization. And so miracles do have to be real events because people are canonized based on them really having happened. Okay, your final realist understanding then is of miracles as a violation of natural law. So this is the idea that a miracle is something that could not have happened if nature alone was at work. So it's an event brought about by the intervention of a supernatural power, which for many is, of course, going to be God. For our theists, it's going to be God, isn't it? So this is the classic account of a miracle. And it's the idea of a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. This actually comes from David Hume. Now, this is where it can get confusing for people, because David Hume isn't saying that he believes miracles happening, but this is his account of miracles. So this is his account of what theists are claiming happens. And so it's really important we know it and that we are then able to critique it. So he believes that a miracle is a transgression. It breaks a law of nature. It is by a particular volition, by an act of will, by the deity, who is God, a deity is a god, or by the interposition, the intervention of some invisible agent. Now, a more contemporary summary of this comes from Mackey, who you'll remember from The Problem of Evil and Suffering, who said we can think of a supernatural intervention as something that intrudes into a system from outside the natural world as a whole. So it's the idea that miracles are when natural laws are broken because of the intervention of God. So God actually intervenes to break a natural law in order to do something that helps someone. For example, your classic example, Jesus rising from the dead. It's a natural law, isn't it? That once you have died, you're dead. That's it. And so God intervenes to do something that goes against the laws of nature. It is a transgression of a law of nature by God. Now, here is the really important critical analysis of this idea that miracles are a violation of natural law. We know that scientists do not accept that natural laws can be violated. So this is really important. Scientists do not believe that natural laws can actually be violated. So they believe that laws of nature are not like laws of legislation. They cannot just be broken. So we can conceive, can't we, of somebody breaking a law of legislation. You know, the law might be do not kill. We can imagine somebody killing and therefore having broken that law. However, scientific laws are not the same. And so it is a mistake to see scientific laws in the same way that you would see legislative laws, because scientific laws cannot be violated, they can only be revised. This is really important to note, that scientific laws cannot be violated, they can only be revised. And so this idea of miracles as a violation of natural law does not make sense. It is completely undermined. It should be discounted, because it does not actually make sense. Because if an event happens that does not conform with what a scientific law predicts, there are three possibilities according to science. And one of them is not that God has transgressed the laws he created and intervened to do something. They are, number one, that the evidence for that particular event is faulty. So that event didn't actually happen. And so, we are mistaken in thinking something has happened that hasn't conformed with a scientific law. So it could be that we don't actually understand the event that is supposedly taking place. There is no actual evidence, or the evidence for that event is faulty. We are mistaken. And so actually no natural law has been broken. Our evidence is faulty. We've misunderstood something. The second one is that there is an unknown factor at play that the law hasn't accounted for. And the third one is that the law needs to be adapted or expanded to take a new event into account. So as you will see, none of these options is that the law must have been broken, and so there must be a supernatural explanation. These three solutions all maintain that scientific laws cannot be broken. So there is your really strong challenge from science on this, that miracles are violations of natural law, because you can argue science says natural laws cannot be violated. And you can use that example of the legislative laws that can be broken, and you can compare that with scientific laws, which would actually be adapted or expanded and revised, rather than someone just saying, okay, yeah, the scientific law has been broken. If it appears that a scientific law has been broken, there is always, scientists believe, a reasonable explanation, so that the evidence for that event in question is faulty, that there is an unknown factor at play that is not yet known, and that the law needs to be adapted or expanded in order to take that new event into account. It is not possible for a scientific law to be violated. It can only be revised. So that, of course, is very problematic for anyone who takes that realist view of miracles. And now another important criticism is from a theist. It's from John Hicks, because he agreed that violation miracles are impossible. And he said if there appears to be an exception to a law of nature, then the law simply expands to include the exception. So you've actually got a theist here agreeing that this realist understanding of miracles is wrong, because violation miracles are impossible. So that would say that miracles cannot be a violation of the natural law, because it is impossible to violate the natural law. And we get that from scientists, and we also get that from John Hicks. So, a really important critique there of that realist view of miracles as actual violations of natural law, because that's just not possible. Okay, so let me bring all of this together for you. These realist understandings of miracles suggest that they are rare or exceptional events, don't they? And that the great majority of events taking place in the world today are not miracles. It is not every day that somebody walks on water. It is not a miracle that the sun has risen this morning, because that is an everyday thing that conforms to the laws of nature. Now, it's important you know that the realist view is not shared by all religious believers. Okay, for some religious believers, a beautiful sunrise or sunset, so an everyday occurrence that does conform to natural laws, can be a miracle, as can be the regular birth of a child. So I'm not talking about a virgin birth. I'm not talking about immaculate conception. I'm talking about an everyday birth. So for some believers, everyday events may be considered miraculous, because everyday events can be interpreted as miracles. This is so important. An everyday event that is in full accordance with the scientific laws can be interpreted, it can be understood in someone's mind, in their form of life, as miraculous. And this is known as the anti-realist view, okay? And the title speaks for itself. It is against the realist view. We've just looked at what the realist view is. It's about this transcendent God who is intervening, getting involved to do these extraordinary things, to bring about, these extraordinary examples of people being saved, these violations of natural laws, and, to do things like parting the Red Sea or helping someone walk on water. They are these extraordinary, rare, exceptional events where you've got this transcendent God intervening at a particular point in history. For anti-realists, that is not an accurate explanation of miracles. That is not what a miracle is. So we're going to have a look at their view, at the anti-realist view, that every event may be considered miraculous. So it's not about having these objective miracles that happen. It's about this subjective interpretation of everyday occurrences that conform to the laws of nature. And this is, as I say, the anti-realist view. So we're going to have a look at this now. In order to do that, we have got another table for you. This time, as you can see, we are looking at our anti-realist examples. We're looking at our anti-realist scholars, and we're going to be looking at their key beliefs and their ideas. So our AO1 understandings of anti-realism in the context of miracles. And then we'll be looking again at our evaluation and our critical analysis in terms of our AO2. So let's get started, shall we? By just asking the question, what is the anti-realist understanding of miracles? Really important we know. And we're going to associate this most importantly, or primarily, I should say, with Tillick and Holland. So anti-realist understandings deny that we can have knowledge of a mind-independent world, since the phenomena observed by our senses are interpreted by the mind. So this is the idea, you know, it reminds me a bit of Berkeley and his philosophy of the mind, you know, the idea that nothing actually objectively exists. Everything is about interpretation. Everything is subjective. It's all in the mind. Now, they would believe that any talk of God as an unobservable something has no cognitive content. So God cannot be discussed meaningfully. And of course, this is a really important link to religious language when you are talking about what makes language meaningful or meaningless. And so a miracle might be seen as something that lifts the spirit or transforms your life. So let me just bring this into sort of a key summary point for you. Anti-realists believe that the idea of miraculous, I can't speak, excuse me, of miraculous intervention, I should say, in this world by a transcendent God is not a sensible idea. So with all those realist examples we had, didn't we, that transcendent God who was performing these miraculous interventions, whether that was saving somebody from a gas explosion, whether that was giving Moses the power to part the Red Sea, or, you know, a saint, somebody who's now a saint being able to do something miraculous, or whether that was a violation of a natural law. We saw, didn't we, this transcendent God who was intervening to perform miracles. Now, for our anti-realists, this is not a sensible idea. This is not a sensible explanation. Instead, miracles are in the mind. They are mental states or attitudes that are to be understood in terms of psychology and sociology. And so, and this is your key point, an anti-realist would focus on the state of mind rather than the event itself. The events would be everyday events that don't break any natural laws and that just commonly occur. For an anti-realist, the focus would be on the meaning for you as an individual, on the impact it has on you in terms of that miracle that you are seeing based on an interpretation. So miracles are interpretations rather than actual exceptional events, if that makes sense. Hopefully it will start to make sense as we unpack them. So Paul Tillick, really important as a key thinker for us. Again, we've spoken about him when we spoke about religious language, and he says that miracles are sign events. So you'll remember when it came to religious language, he spoke a lot about signs and symbols. And he says that miracles cannot be interpreted in terms of a supernatural interference in natural processes. So this is a brilliant AO2 point if you are criticizing the realist view of miracles, because you've got a theist here saying that miracles cannot be interpreted as supernatural interferences in natural processes. And we know why, because, you know, we've seen that scientists tell us that you cannot break a natural law, but then we've also raised questions about why would God sometimes intervene to save some people, but then do nothing in other circumstances. And so, you know, it raises questions about the nature of God as well. A God who picks and chooses who he intervenes to help does not necessarily seem very omnibenevolent. And so Paul Tillick is saying that we cannot understand miracles as supernatural interferences in natural processes. And so we have to think about, well, what are they then? You know, if they are not supernatural interferences in natural processes, what actually are they? If they aren't these interventions, What are they? How do we explain them? What do we mean when we talk about miracles? And I think Holland has a great way of putting it, because Holland says that instead we should see them in this way, as a coincidence that can be taken religiously as a sign and called a miracle. And so miracles are very much about personal interpretation. They are subjective interpretations, because it's when something happens, there is a coincidence, for example, that happens, that takes place. For example, all those people surviving the gas explosion, that can be taken religiously as a sign and called a miracle. So that coincidence of the Nebraska gas explosion, that is, a really extraordinary coincidence, isn't it? And for those people involved, they might take it religiously. And when I say take it religiously, I mean interpret it and understand it religiously within their religious form of life. And they might see that as a sign that, God loves them, that God cares for them. And they would call that a miracle, because they would take it, they would interpret it religiously as part of their belief system and call it a miracle. So it has meaning for them, it has value for them, and that is what matters, because within their minds they have interpreted it in a religious way as a significant sign that God exists, that God is love, and that God cares for them, and they've called it a miracle. It's not a miracle in the realist sense of the term. It's a coincidence that has been interpreted as a miracle. So let's unpack this a bit further. We're going to start with a deep dive on Paul Tillick. So let me just shrink this box so you can actually see. Do excuse my hair today, guys. I don't know what's happened. I feel like pausing the video and sorting it out. However, we've got to talk about Tillick. So Paul Tillick holds the view that religious language is symbolic. He says, and you may remember this from our conversations about religious language, that God is the ground of being, or being itself. Okay, so really important that we connect the dots here in terms of that key synoptic link. Now, on miracles, it therefore won't surprise you, he doesn't understand them in the realist terms of interventions in the world by a transcendent God. Instead, he sees miracles as sign events that cannot be divorced from their religious context. Here's a key quote. He said, "First of all, an event which is astonishing, unusual, shaking, without contradicting the rational structure of reality." Really important, without contradicting the rational structure of reality. So these events do not violate natural laws. They do not contradict the rational structure of reality. They are not extraordinary interventions. In the second place, it is an event which points to the mystery of being, expressing its relation to us in a definite way. Really important. Again, they are pointing to something. Yeah. So a bit like his argument on signs and symbols, they are events which lead us to believing something. They are a trigger. They are a catalyst, if you like. They are like a sign that points us towards believing something. And thirdly, it is an occurrence which is received as a sign event in an ecstatic experience. So again, they are signs. They are symbols. They conform to the natural laws. They do not contradict the natural structure, the rational structure, of reality, but they point us to something and they leave us feeling a certain way. Now, in order for something to be considered a miracle, the event has to be astonishing without breaking any law of nature. So again, it could be seeing a beautiful sunset or a beautiful sunrise. It could be the birth of your first child. It's something that's not necessarily mundane. It's not something that you are going to take for granted, basically. It's got to astonish you, but it's still got to conform to the laws of nature. And it must point to the mystery of being and a sign or symbol within a religious experience. So, the key word I would use here is numinous. Those moments when you have that feeling of something greater than you existing, when you feel overwhelmed. And it's in those moments that miracles happen, because these astonishing events, I can't speak, these astonishing events happen. They don't break any laws of nature, but they leave us with this overwhelming feeling. They leave us feeling that we've seen a sign. that we've seen a sign and we interpret it as a miracle within our religious form of life. So yeah, miracles are sign events. They are astonishing events which don't break any laws of nature, but they leave us feeling that we've seen a sign, that we've seen something unusual, we're shaken by it, it's had an impact on us, it's going to change our lives. And it, it leaves us in the same way that William James said about religious experiences, it leaves us with this sense of wonder and amazement. Yeah, it has that really big impact on us. And so we've got to make that link to religious experiences here. Otto, for example, when he said that religious experiences are mysterious, tremendum, et fascinam, that idea that they have this massive impact on you. Tillick is saying that it's not something that breaks any law of nature, but it's still a big deal for you because of the impact it has on you and the changes it might lead to you making in your life. Okay, next point for us then is Keith Ward, and he can be used to support Tillick. So he is another key theologian who supports Tillick, and he builds on what Tillick said because he calls miracles epiphanies of spirit. So an epiphany is like an awakening. So again, that idea that these miracles are signs, this is the idea here from Ward, that they are epiphanies, that they awaken us, that they teach us something. So here's a few key quotes from him that you can use in your essay. He said, the subjective element of the apprehension of a miracle rather than the objective nature of the event itself. So that is what he's saying we should focus on. Whenever we're thinking about and talking about miracles, we should focus on the subjective element of the apprehension of the miracle. So it's all about how you have apprehended it, how you've comprehended it, and the impact it's had on you. So again, a little bit like with William James, we're thinking more about the fruits rather than the roots. We're thinking about how it impacts you, the awakening it gives you, the enlightenment it provides you with, rather than the origin of it. Whereas the realist, of course, would be much more focused on whether it really happened, whether it was a real event, whereas your anti-realist here is thinking about the impact it has on you, the meaning and significance it has for you. He said that something astonishes me. So again, that idea of them being astonishing, that it discloses to me the ultimate mystery of my being. So it reveals something to you, and that it is received by me in a commitment of faith. These are all in the end remarks about me and my reactions. And that is important because the anti-realist focuses on you. It's about you, your mind, your faith, your beliefs. Whereas for the realist, they obviously want to take that objective view, don't they? So the realist is very much focused on, did it really happen? Whereas your anti-realist is about asking, what does it mean for me? What is the impact on me? He talks about Tillick. He says Tillick is quite explicit that miracles cannot be interpreted in terms of a supernatural interference in natural processes. As we know, such a thing would destroy the natural structure of events, and it is reminiscent, he thinks, of superstitious beliefs in demonism and sorcery. So the idea that miracles would be violations of natural laws is reminiscent of superstitious beliefs in demonism and sorcery. So it's outdated. We need to outgrow that idea of miracles, that we can't think of miracles in that way anymore. It's not fashionable anymore. It's not mainstream anymore. We have to evolve in our understanding of miracles. We cannot be believing in these superstitious beliefs about God breaking natural laws. That is an outdated viewpoint. It's quite an immature viewpoint. And here's a really important line. Tillick wishes to keep the seamless causal robe of nature intact. So miracles become patches of that robe, which astonish me and cause me to re-envision and re-establish my inner relation to the ground of being. So of course, ground of being, that key phrase Tillick uses to talk about God. So the idea here is that miracles have to conform to the natural laws, because Tillick wants to keep that causal robe of nature intact. He doesn't want it broken. He doesn't want to talk about violations where God has broken the laws of nature. Those laws need to remain, intact. The miracles have to be part of it. They are patches of that robe. So they are parts of the natural world that conform to the natural laws, which astonish you and cause you to rethink and reevaluate your life. it's having that inner transformation. Yeah. So again, it's about the impact. And then last but not least, the most important quote: the robe remains intact. The miracle is mainly in my mind. I think that is your best quote for the anti-realist view. Yeah. The miracle is mainly in my mind. That is where the miracle takes place. It's about the impact on you rather than the objective event itself. It's about the interpretation and the impact it's had on you. That is where the miracle occurs. That is what our focus is on. It's on you and your reaction to it, not on whether it actually happened. It's on you and your reaction to it. Okay, we can then keep on building, because we can now bring in John Hick, who said a miracle is any event that is experienced as a miracle, which is really significant because it really, again, emphasizes that idea that they are interpretations of the mind. It is any everyday event that obviously conforms to the laws of nature that I experience, I interpret, I understand as a miracle. So he said, for a miracle, whatever else it may be, is an event through which we become vividly and immediately conscious of God acting towards us. A startling happening. So again, that idea of it being astonishing, even if it should involve a suspension of natural law, does not constitute for us a miracle in the religious sense of the word if it fails to make us intensely aware of being in God's presence. And so he says, you know, when he is saying here that miracles are all about awareness of God. And he's saying, you know, that awareness of God could be found by seeing that sunset, for example, or the birth of your first child. You know, it is about awareness within you. Again, the focus is on you and the impact it has on you. Miracles can't happen without human beings who feel close to God. It is all about focusing on you, your feelings, how it impacts on you. And so your key line here is that in order to be miraculous, an event must be experienced as religiously significant. So again, it's all about interpretation. It's all about personal understanding. Indeed, we may say that a miracle is any event that is experienced as a miracle. So there we go. If you experience it as a miracle, it is a miracle. Now, of course, for our realists who look at it through that, you know, scientific objective lens, they're not going to agree with that at all, are they? They're going to be appalled. They're going to be outraged because they believe that miracles have to be real events. Whereas for Hick, he's saying a miracle is any event that is experienced as a miracle. And of course, this has, you know, massive links. There are major synoptic links here to religious language, to Wittgenstein, language games, you know, and how we use language. To just say that any event that is subjectively experienced as a miracle is a miracle, obviously is, you know, going to have significant implications when you're talking about truth claims and, you know, that idea of verification and empirically verifiable propositions, for example. But just as a key point on the anti-realist view here, a miracle is any event that is experienced as a miracle. And your key point there is that it's experienced as. It's all about that subjective individual interpretation, what meaning it has for you in your mind. Okay, so one more then. We have got Roy Holland, who said that miracles have meaning within forms of life. So this is a really key link to religious language, because he was a member of a group of philosophers called the Swansea Wittgensteinians. And he believes that our interpretation of events as miraculous is based on our beliefs and the form of life we subscribe to. Okay, so for example, a Christian may interpret a beneficial coincidence in a religious way as a result of divine intervention. Holland argues there is actually nothing miraculous about these coincidences, but that we interpret them based on our beliefs. Yes, so we interpret things based on the form of life we're operating in, the religion we belong to, for example. So, you know, if I lived in and this is a link to religious pluralism, actually, if I lived in an Buddhist country, for example, I might interpret that beneficial coincidence through a Buddhist lens, whereas if I lived in a Christian country, I might interpret that beneficial coincidence through a Christian lens. So it's all about our beliefs. It's all about the forms of life that we belong to. And, you know, that's what shapes our understandings and our interpretations, our forms of life and the beliefs that we have. As Wittgenstein would say, these events belong to the form of life to which we subscribe. And in that context, it is personally perfectly, sensible to call them miracles. So, if I am a Christian and there is a beneficial coincidence, it makes sense for me to call that a miracle. It is meaningful for me. Yeah, calling these events miracles is a meaningful thing for people within the religious form of life. Because, and here's your key point, it is consistent with that belief you have in the existence of a loving, caring, involved, immanent God. And so the key point here is that miracles have meaning within a form of life. So for someone who believes in God, it makes sense to call a beneficial coincidence a miracle, whereas for an atheist it wouldn't. Why would they start believing in God? They would just see it as good luck. They'd just see it as one of those things. But for somebody who is a Christian, for example, and that's the way they look at the world, that's the form of life they operate in, it makes sense to call that, interpret that, and understand that as a miracle. So it's a very, again, subjective thing, isn't it? Because what you see as a miracle is based on your form of life. Whether you believe something is a coincidence or a miracle is going to be based entirely on your pre-existing beliefs. And again, a realist would be appalled at this because they'd say, well, it's either a miracle or it's not. It's either that a transcendent God has intervened and done something or it's not. You can't just say, well, if you're Christian, then yeah, of course it's a miracle. But if you're an atheist, then no, it's not a miracle. A realist would say, is it a miracle or not? We need objective facts, like in a science lab. You can't say, well, if you want to believe in gravity, you can. But if you don't want to believe in gravity, you don't have to. Scientists want things to be objective. It's black and white, whereas this is obviously not black and white. This is saying, well, if it makes sense to you because you're a Christian to call it a miracle, go for it. And actually, again, for Christians, do Christians believe that miracles subjectively happen? Do they believe that God actually orchestrates them, that he intervenes and causes them? Or do they believe that they're just coincidences that they've decided to label as miracles? So actually on both sides, atheists and theists would have something to say, I think, about this idea that miracles have meaning within a form of life, that everything is limited to those language games that you are playing. But yeah, a really great synoptic link here and a really great anti-realist understanding of miracles, that they are interpretations of the mind, that, people who operate within a theistic form of life will interpret beneficial coincidences as miracles. And Holland is saying that's fine for them to do so, but he's simultaneously saying it's fine for someone who doesn't believe in God to not interpret it in this way and to not find this meaningful to them within their atheistic form of life. So yeah, really interesting actually in terms of how subjective this idea of a miracle can be. And, it doesn't actually matter, according to Holland, whether it is from God or not. It's all about whether calling it a miracle has meaning for you within your form of life. And of course that links in, doesn't it, with Wittgenstein's religious language ideas very nicely indeed. Okay, so in terms of your critical analysis on anti-realist views, then we have to think, when a theist speaks of miracles, are they talking about interpretations? Are they talking about something having meaning for them personally? Or are they talking about them as objective real events? I would think about this in terms of what day of the week it is. Today, as I film this for you, it's Thursday, right? And that is an objective fact. I can't sit here and go, well, for me, within my form of life, today it's Friday. But for my brother in his form of life, today is Tuesday. But that's wonderful. It's meaningful to us as individuals because I like Fridays and he likes Tuesdays. You can't do that, can you? You have to either say it's Thursday, Friday, or Tuesday. And the fact of the matter is, today is Thursday. It's not about my personal form of life. It's an objective fact that in the United Kingdom, it is 2:10 on a Thursday. And so we have to ask, when a theist speaks of miracles, are they talking about something that they've interpreted in their mind as being a miracle, which they could see as a bit insulting, to be honest, couldn't they? If you just say, if you want to think that, if that's your interpretation, there you go, darling. It could be seen as a bit insulting. Or do they think they are real events? I would say that they need to see them as real events because of what St. Paul said, that if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is pointless and you are still in your sins. You know, if that's the case, then you need to believe in the resurrection having actually happened. I can't say it's just an interpretation in my mind that has meaning within my form of life. Because if I believe that my entire religion depends on Jesus Christ actually rising from the dead, I'm going to need to be a realist, aren't I? According to what St. Paul is saying here. And of course, we have to think about the implications of the anti-realist view for understandings of the resurrection. Did it actually happen? Or are we just saying it's an interpretation of the mind? It also has implications for our understanding of other key miracles. You know, if you think about healing at Lourdes, were you healed or not? Surely we can objectively check that, is what a realist would say, whereas an anti-realist would say, well, if you interpret that, then that has meaning for you as a miracle. But was that a miraculous healing or not? And your realist is going to want to know. Obviously, the anti-realist view has implications for the idea of Jesus's divinity, because if Jesus didn't perform those 37 miracles, if again they're just interpretations of the mind that have meaning within a form of life, then was he divine or not? You know, surely those miracles had to happen as objective proof. Belief in life after death as well, of course. You know, if miracles don't actually objectively happen, they are just seen subjectively as interpretations of the mind, then can we have life after death? Is life after death, excuse me, all in the mind as well? Or does that actually happen objectively? Is it a real thing or not? The entire religion, of course, is founded upon a miracle. So if you're saying that that didn't really happen, what are you saying about the religion as a whole? And then obviously all your religious language links. You know, when we're speaking about miracles, are we talking about them being true or simply true for certain people? And that, of course, raises big questions, doesn't it? About the validity of religious language and about the validity of religious claims. When somebody says that they believe in miracles or they believe Jesus rose from the dead, do they believe that that is a fact, or do they simply believe that that is a personal belief, a personal interpretation in their mind? So, you know, we have to think, and this is difficult, we have to be thinking, what do theists think about miracles? When they speak about miracles, are they talking about interpretations or are they talking about real events? And you've got to think, you know, which is the most compatible with 21st century thinking as well. You know, as we've seen, some people think that to maintain that realist view of miracles is, you know, quite outdated and quite dangerous. And it links back to times of sorcery and demonic things. Whereas, of course, on the other hand, you could argue, well, if these miracles are now no longer seen as real events, what do you actually believe in? You know, if it's just an interpretation of the mind. So, as I say, it is complex. I've given you a lot to think about there, but really important for our critical analysis in our essays. So what we are going to do to help us make a little bit more sense of this is have a look at the thoughts of David Hume and Maurice Wiles. Now, we need to know them for the exam. They could be named in a question because they are named on the AQA specification. So we're going to be having a look at their key ideas. We're going to be looking at Hume and his critique of the realist understanding, and we're going to be looking at Wiles and his support and endorsement for the anti-realist understanding. And for each of them, we're going to be filling in, as you can see, 3 boxes. So for Hume, we're going to look at the key points he makes, and we'll look at his idea that it's impossible for human testimony to prove a miracle, and that claims of miracles are faith-based fabrications. So as I say, he critiques that realist view, whereas for Wiles, he supports the anti-realist view. So again, we'll look at his key points. We'll then look at language about miracles as symbolic, not literal. And then we'll look in particular at Jesus and the 37 New Testament miracles. So again, please do make sure you've got this sheet in front of you so you can fill it in as we talk through each of these key points. A great revision resource or a great essay planning resource as well if you are writing any essays on this. So in terms of a key overview for you, what are the key points that we need to know? Well, David Hume is an atheist. He believes that there is no God who is able to violate natural laws. He takes, however, a realist approach to miracles. He and this is important, assumes that biblical accounts of miracles are to be seen as literally true. So that is his understanding. Although he doesn't personally believe in God, he believes that when a Christian picks up their Bible, here's one to hand for you, nice little coronation Bible for the king. He believes that when Christians pick up their Bible and read it, they believe that what they're reading is literally true. It's not meant to be, symbolic. It's meant to be literally true. That's what they believe when they talk about the Bible as being the infallible word of God. He focuses as an empiricist on evidence. His key concern in life really is on evidence. And of course, in this case, he focuses on the lack of, and that's why he critiques miracles, because he says from his realist standpoint that there are no facts, there is no evidence, excuse me. So he is a realist, and his realism leads him to believe that miracles are not true. Whereas for Wiles, he is an anti-realist, and he is also a Christian. So he believes that God does exist, but chooses not to intervene. So that's why Wiles is not a realist himself, even though he is a theist. He takes, as I say, an anti-realist approach to miracles. He argues that the biblical accounts are symbolic, they are myths. So, of course, that is a key contrast with David Hume. And he focused on the message behind the miracles. Okay, so as we spoke about before, it's about the meaning, isn't it? It's about the value for the individual. And so with Hume, he was focused on the actual event and the lack of evidence for it, whereas Wiles would be looking internally. He'd be looking at the message, at the meaning, at the value for the individual. So these are the two lenses we're going to look at. I want to start then with Hume, because Hume said it is impossible for human testimony to prove a miracle. He is an empiricist who seeks to subject accounts of miracles to proper scrutiny. And he works on the understanding that the more evidence we have for any event, the higher its probability. He is an empiricist, and that is, of course, at the core of empiricism. This principle is fundamental to science, and Hume applies it to accounts of miracles. Now, he defines miracles as a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity, or by the interposition, of some invisible agent. That is, of course, a realist understanding, because he is a realist about life, so he is going to take a realist understanding of miracles. Even though he doesn't believe that miracles therefore happen, that is the lens through which he looks at them, if that makes sense. He says, and this is his big problem, reports of miracles such as Jesus walking on water cannot be repeated or tested. And we know that that is key from our religion and science topic on paper 2. That is key in order for something to have scientific credibility. He said miracles are always maximally improbable events. This necessary improbability defeats the idea that a miracle has happened, because if you think, in order to believe something has happened, you need as much evidence as possible. Whereas with miracles, the opposite is true. They are maximally improbable. So he says, no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any system of religion. So there is no human testimony that can prove a miracle. Somebody saying they've seen or experienced a miracle isn't going to be sufficient. And he says, therefore, it can never be the foundation for any system of belief. So he's saying it is foolish for Christianity to be founded on belief in the resurrection of Jesus. That idea that Jesus rose from the dead, that St. Paul writes about, and St. Paul says, 500 people saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. For Hume, that's not enough. No human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a foundation for any system of religion. And he goes on to say, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavours to establish. So he is saying there is no proof for miracles, therefore do not believe in them. It is impossible for human testimony to prove a miracle. They should not be used as the foundation for a religion. So a very clear criticism of Christianity here. In terms of your counter argument for this, I am thinking of Swinburne's principles of testimony and credulity. So could you maybe use them, so a great link to religious experience, to talk about this issue of testimony, and to actually argue that if someone says they have seen or experienced a miracle, you should believe them, that is sufficient. For Hume, it's not. He's not buying it, he's not believing it, and he thinks this should not be the foundation for a belief system such as a religion, because it is insufficient. These miracles cannot be repeated or tested. The claims people make cannot be verified, and miracles are maximally improbable events, and so you should not believe them. There is no sufficient evidence. He goes on to say then that claims of miracles are actually faith-based fabrications. So he says, and this is a great quote to use, the Christian religion is founded on faith, not on reason, and he thinks that is a problem. He writes that most accounts of miracles come from ignorant and barbarous nations, and where they are found in civilized countries, this is because those people, those countries, had ignorant and barbarous ancestors. He says, looking back through history, we cannot find even one strong example of a miracle properly attested by men of sufficient good sense, integrity, education, and learning. So, he's really, really going for it now with his criticism. He says, none of the miracle accounts available to us would convince us that the witnesses were not deluded, mistaken, or lying. So he's really, again, criticizing the human testimony for miracles. He's saying it's not sufficient. It is biased. It is incredible in terms of it's not credible, and he's saying it just doesn't convince us. We don't have sufficient evidence. The witnesses don't have sufficient credibility. He says humans are naturally credulous. The feeling of surprise and wonder arising from miracles is enough to make people of common sense less sensible. When we add strong religious feeling, there is an end of common sense. And so he says that actually religious people may know that the miracles they believe in are false, but they preserve them because they believe the cause to be holy. And so the more that they believe it because they want to believe it, the more deluded they become. Their common sense is abandoned. And he says, this is a real problem. People are taking leave of their senses. They're buying into these ridiculous stories about miracles, such as Jesus rising from the dead. They're then passing them on to their children. And obviously, as you pass it on, the lie, the myth, the mistake gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then people start to believe it for absolutely no reason, without any evidence whatsoever. So he is saying that claims of miracles are faith-based fabrications. People want to believe it's true. I really want to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but Hume is saying he didn't. There is no credible evidence for this. There is no evidence of a miracle from people of sufficient good sense, integrity, education, and learning. St. Paul, the disciples, the witnesses to Jesus's resurrection, they were not graduates of the University of Oxford. They were not top scientists. So he's saying that they allowed their feelings and their beliefs and their emotions to cloud their judgment, and it led to them trying to desperately believe in something that just isn't factually correct. But then that story has just got out of hand, basically, and now over 2 billion people believe it to be true. But yes, really powerful, forceful critique from Hume, our realist Hume, who says that miracles or claims of miracles are faith-based fabrications. If we have a look at the other side of the argument, then, if we look at Wiles and his argument that is based on the anti-realist point of view, he was a professor of Christian doctrine at King's College London, and he wrote that it is especially important to emphasize the symbolic character of these symbols. So he talks about them as symbolic rather than actual. He warns that a literal understanding, so the realist understanding, means the whole relation of God and the world becomes a nest of absurdities. So he is acknowledging that if you take that realist view, it opens up a nest of absurdities. So he is saying we must avoid it. We must avoid a literal understanding. He goes on to say, so this is again another criticism of the realist understanding of miracles. So both of them are criticizing the realist understanding of miracles. He says the idea of a God who sometimes chooses to intervene with the laws of nature is unfair. So, a bit like what we said when we did our critical analysis, when we said, it raises questions about omnibenevolence. He said it is not merely implausible and superfluous from the standpoint of human explanation, but religiously unsatisfactory in view of their apparently occasional and highly selective character. So that is a great criticism, a great quote to use if you're talking about the realist view on miracles. He said that it is a religiously unsatisfactory explanation because they are apparently occasional and highly selective. And he has obviously a big problem with that. He's saying, that is not fair. The idea of a God who sometimes chooses to intervene is implausible and it's religiously unsatisfactory. So that is why, although he's a theist, he is not a realist when it comes to miracles. He also links this to the problem of evil and suffering. So a really brilliant synoptic link for us here. He said the direct intervention of God, however rare the occasions of it, would have disastrous implications for our understanding of the problem of evil. So, if you do believe in miracles as violations of the natural law by a transcendent God, that has disastrous implications for the problem of evil, because it would of course suggest that God can do something, but then he's choosing not to. And what does that say about God and his omnibenevolence? So really powerful criticism here of the realist view, demonstrating why he believes that miracles are not real events in the way that a realist would see them, because he sees it as implausible, as religiously unsatisfactory, and as having disastrous implications. So some fantastic sound bites there to be using in your essay. And he goes on to say that for the critical reader of scripture today, the miracle tradition is highly problematic. There can be little doubt that for the tradition to have arisen at all, Jesus must have been a remarkable exorcist and healer. Beyond that, it is hard to speak with any confidence of the history that lies behind the traditions. But our concern is not simply with what happened, but with its meaning for those who developed and passed on the tradition. The healing ministry of Jesus is firmly set within the context of a conflict with evil. So again, he is saying here that it is highly problematic, it is disastrous, it is an issue to see these miracles as real events that objectively happened. He is saying here that, we have to think of this in terms of the symbolic value, in terms of the meaning that it provides and it develops for the religious believer. So let's deep dive into this. He said you need to consider the symbolic significance of the miracles that Jesus performed. So it's not about whether it actually happened or not. It's about what meaning it has, what it signals to you, what symbolic value it has. He said Jesus engages in actions to oppose evil, and healing miracles are part of that campaign. They are also seen as signs of the coming kingdom. Another great link to paper 2 when you talk about self-death and afterlife and the purpose of life for Christians. However, Wiles believes that they are wrongly interpreted if seen as factual descriptions. And we're going to link in here with what Reza Aslan was saying as well. He says they are myths. They are presented in order to express something about God. So the gospel writers included them as myths. They did not intend for them to be taken literally. He said that Jesus' refusal to provide an overwhelmingly convincing miracle illustrates just how mistaken it is to try to use accounts of miracles as proof of God's power. Wiles believes that there is one miracle alone that we should focus on, and that is God's creation of the world itself. Now, this has led to some viewing Wiles as more of a deist than a Christian. So there's some great critical analysis. Wiles is actually saying that Jesus's miracles are symbolic myths, that they've been included in order to signal something, in order to symbolize something, rather than actually as factual, accurate accounts. And that is certainly something Reza Aslan would agree with. Remember, he said that they are, theological embellishments. Now, the point here, the criticism of that, is that, well, if you're saying Jesus didn't actually do these things, that they're just included as symbols for the reader, what is the implication in terms of God? Because if God didn't perform miracles through Jesus, does he actually care? Is Jesus even divine? So really serious questions that are raised in terms of God, God's relationship with the world, the idea of providence, for example, and the person of Jesus Christ. So in terms of what these two key thinkers believe, we've got to know, if we take a step back now, that their view on miracles is completely different. Wiles points out that what counts as a miracle is a matter of personal interpretation because it is a symbol, not a matter of physical fact. The implication of this is that the sort of discussion Hume wishes to have is ineffective, it's redundant, because it does not touch on the personal and religious elements in events that are essential if they are to be seen as miracles. For Hume, unless a miracle is at least an event that is so unexpected and unexplained that it appears to be a violation of a law of nature, there is little point in calling it a miracle at all. So they seem to be having really two different conversations, don't they? Because Wiles' approach abandons Hume's idea of a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, which of course we know anti-realists reject, in favour of a more holistic view of God's activity, whether that takes the form of establishing the fundamental principles by which the world operates, or of inspiring people to strive to overcome evil and suffering. By taking this approach, Wiles does not necessarily answer Hume's challenge, but sidesteps it, doesn't he, by redefining the spheres of God's activity from something very specific, that idea of these, direct violations of natural laws, to something more general. This may be seen as a strength because it points to the limited nature of Hume's empiricism when approaching matters of religion. And I really like that as a line to include in your essay, actually. The limited nature of Hume's empiricism. If you are simply going to restrict everything, and obviously we said this about religious language, to what can be empirically verified, then that limits you massively, doesn't it, in terms of not only your understanding of religion, but your understanding of human experience. So we need to just conclude now by reflecting on the significance of these two different views for Christians. So let's start with the realist view. What is the significance of realist views for Christianity? Well, in terms of the biblical and eschatological significance, the Gospels record 37 miracles performed by Jesus himself, don't they? These include miracles of healing, exorcism, miracles over nature, and even resuscitations. The New Testament writers used a number of terms for these events, and it's really important that, they are seen as signs of the arrival of God's kingdom. But remember, for the realist, they really happened. They are events that happened. And of course, the most important one is the central miracle of the New Testament, which is, of course, the resurrection of Christ. St. Paul writes that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is pointless and you are still in your sins. Now, all four Gospels record this as actually happening. For example, Luke 24 says he is risen. So it really happened, we seem to be told here. Paul writes that Jesus then appeared to over 500 people. So, in terms of testimony there, as Hume was talking about, is that not sufficient testimony? Of course, we could argue back that that could be embellished, that could be a fabrication. If Christ has not actually risen from the dead, then there cannot be resurrection of the body for Christians either. And so, of course, this emphasizes the importance of this event having actually happened. So that is why Christians would be realist if they want to believe that they will have life after death as well, that is beyond a state of mind. And of course, your key point there is that Christianity is grounded in belief in biblical miracles. In terms of the divine significance then, in terms of what does this tell us about God? Well, the doctrine of God's providence means that God is believed to care for his creation. God's providence is based on his characteristics of omnipotence and omnibenevolence. As the all-powerful and all-loving creator, God has both the power and love to be active in the world. God therefore intervenes through both general and special revelation. General revelation involves experiences of God given through reason and conscience, whereas special revelation involves experiences of God through religious experiences. Dreams, visions, voices, conversion experiences, and of course, miracles. Whereas Hume defined miracles as violations of natural laws done by a particular volition of the deity, Hume clearly believed that miracles do not occur. So as I've mentioned several times, he is a realist, and so he takes the realist understanding of miracles and he says they don't really happen. But then he's not going to jump, we don't think, to taking an anti-realist view because he's a realist. Many Christians accept Hume's definition, but conclude, of course, that he's wrong, that they do then actually occur as demonstrations of God's power and love. And so the key point is that miracles confirm God's providence and care. In terms then of the significance of anti-realist views for Christianity, remember Tillick sees God not as a being, but as the ground of being, as being itself. Miracles cannot contradict the rational structure of reality. They do not violate the laws of nature, so they are not interventions by a transcendent God. They are instead sign events that cannot be divorced from their religious context, which is religious experience. The significance of miracles is therefore a very personal, subjective, individual thing, isn't it? It is primarily personal and psychological. Holland sees miracles as events with deep personal significance. Wiles sees miracles as events that reveal something of God's intentions for the world. So the miracles in the New Testament are myths that are about inspiring people to overcome evil and suffering. The significance of these interpretations for a theist is that miracles do not relate to events brought about by a real God. Rather, their reality is in the mind, and that is your key focus, of course, of the person who experiences the event. It has personal significance. And just take a moment to think, does this approach work? For example, does the cosmological argument argue that God exists as the reason why the universe exists? Or is God just a way of looking at and explaining the world? So are miracles real events or just things that have personal meaning and significance? And so that leads me to a final question before I share with you some practice paper questions. Do you think most Christians today are realists or anti-realists about miracles? Which one makes the most sense and which one is the most widespread, do you think? When they pick up their Bible, do they see them as real events or do they see them as symbols that are meant to inspire them? Now think about this in the context of paper 2 as well. Make those synoptic links and do let me know what you think in the comments. Finally then, just to share with you your exam style questions, you could get a 10 marker saying to examine realist and anti-realist views about miracles. You could get a 15 marker saying that in the 21st century, anti-realist views on miracles are more reasonable than realist views. Couple more for you. You could be asked to examine the key ideas of Hume on miracles, and you could also be asked as a 15 marker, Wiles' view on miracles poses a greater challenge for those who believe in miracles than the views of Hume. So yeah, just a little flavour there of how you could be asked about all of this in the exam. But thank you very much for watching. Anything you'd add, do let me know in the comments. Any thoughts of your own on miracles? It is always great to hear your perspectives and your conclusions. Have a great day. Good luck with your studies, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.